Now, one of the most disconcerting verses in the Quran, to me, is Surah 2:216. And it says this: fighting is prescribed for you, and ye dislike it. But it is possible you dislike a thing which is good for you, and you love a thing which is bad for you. Allah knoweth, and you knoweth not. Now that was the Yusuf Ali translation. Here's the Pickthall translation. It says, warfare is ordained for you, though it is hateful unto you. But it may happen that you hate a thing which is good for you, and it may happen that you love a thing which is bad for you. Allah knoweth, and you knoweth not. Here's the Shakir translation. Fighting is enjoined on you, and it is an object of dislike for you. But it may happen that you dislike a thing while it is good for you, and so forth. In other words, this is a verse to circumvent the conviction of the Holy Spirit. So you're about to kill somebody, and the Holy Spirit convicts you and says, this is wrong, and it makes you feel bad about doing it. I dislike this, I hate this, I don't feel good about it. And you're about to do it, and then you read this verse, and it says, warfare is ordained for you, though it is hateful unto you, though you dislike it, though it is an object of dislike for you. Allah knoweth, and you knoweth not. So it's like, I feel real bad about doing this, but I got to do it anyway. And so it is designed to deaden that little small voice that we've learned so much about. My wife sells insurance in St. Louis. And Bill Clinton had moved 30,000 Bosnians to St. Louis. And my wife would go into their home and sell them a policy. And the man will buy a policy on his wife, but not on himself. And she says, what if you die? Don't you want your wife to get money? He's like, nah. And so, sometimes she'll pull the wife aside and says, we can put him as a rider on your policy. But one time she said, well, now you're Muslim and everything. Does that mean that you'll kill me? And they said, no. That's just if they declare jihad. She goes, well, what if they declare jihad? Well, we'd have to kill you. She goes, well, I'm your insurance agent. Don't you like me? Go, we like you a lot, but we'd have to kill you. In other words, they dislike it. They don't want to do it, but they feel like they have to do it out of obedience to Allah. So, in other words, Jesus taught to have a personal relationship with God. In Islam, it's blasphemy to even want to have a personal relationship with Allah because he's transcendent and unknowable. You simply obey him. So anyway, when Muhammad died in 632 AD, Islam had spread from the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea all the way up to the Mediterranean Sea along those caravan routes. And then this is a picture of the killing of the Jews in Medina. And you can see the slicing off of a head there. And this is the Kaaba, that where inside of it is a black rock that for centuries before Muhammad, they kissed and worshiped toward this rock, and he incorporated that into the Islamic belief. Again, this is the picture there in Mecca. And this is a map where the orange area shows that the area conquered during Muhammad's life, and then the next yellowish area is the area conquered under Caliph Umar. Now, the first caliph after Muhammad died was Abu Bakr. He was the father of Aisha, the 6-year-old that married, and he had the Ridda Wars, and for 2 years he killed anybody that wouldn't acknowledge him as the supreme leader. Well, he was murdered, and then Umar took over, and Umar conquered this huge area toward Egypt. One of his generals was Khalid ibn al-Walid, who was called the Drawn Sword of Allah. He was undefeated in nearly 100 battles. You can see where they conquered all the way into Persia, all the way up near the Caspian Sea toward the Black Sea, edging on the Byzantine Empire. That purple area there was the European area, but first you see was the Byzantine Empire. And anyway, Caliph Umar, when he conquered Alexandria in Egypt, they asked him what to do with the books in the library. The largest and oldest library in the world was in Alexandria. And his response, reportedly, was that he said every book that does not agree with the Quran should be destroyed. And every book that does agree with the Quran is redundant because we have the Quran. So they destroyed them all. Anyway, then they conquered the North Africa. People forget there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa in the 7th century. And they were all conquered by the Muslims. St. Augustine of Hippo was from Carthage, North Africa. Today that's Tunisia. Egypt, the Christian church was started there by Mark that wrote the gospel. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So Coptic Christians trace their origins to the evangelist Mark. Well, when the Muslims conquered Egypt, there's a hadith, a verse that says, leave no high grave standing nor a work of art without obliterating it. So that's why they would destroy artwork. But they would take the bones of the Christian saints out of their elaborate graves and they would give the bones to the dogs. And so the Christians there took the bones of their famous St. Mark and they shipped them over to Italy, to Florence. And if you've ever been to Florence, they have St. Mark's Cathedral. You know, with the gondolas and the piazza and this big, beautiful church with the domes in the background, that's St. Mark's. You know how they moved his bones? They packed them under pork, and that way the Muslims didn't want to inspect it, because to them pork is unclean. It's sort of interesting why they call Christians pigs, or they say Jews are from apes and Christians are from pigs. So that's sort of like the lowest thing that they don't want to touch. Anyway, then the Muslims conquered all of Persia. Persia was the Zoroastrian Empire. Now, Persia had been at war with the Byzantine Empire for decades. And they actually won, and the Persians destroyed every church in the Holy Land except the one in Bethlehem, because it had a mural of the three wise men on the wall who had come from the east. But when Islam expanded, there was sort of this power vacuum, because these two empires had worked to defeat each other's resources so much. And then in 638 AD is when Caliph Umar conquered Jerusalem. People forget Jerusalem used to be a Byzantine Christian city. And Caliph Umar surrounded the city, and after a couple months of a bloody siege, Bishop Sophronius, the Byzantine bishop, stood on the walls and surrendered the city. And Caliph Umar agreed not to kill everybody in Jerusalem if they would agree to be second-class citizens called dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I. That's sort of like the word diminish. Anyway, this dhimmi status meant that every year you had to buy your life. You had to ransom your life. It's called the jizya. And if any year you didn't pay it, then you could be killed or your family could be taken. And the dhimmi status meant you could not pray out loud. You could not ring church bells. If a Muslim walked into a room, you had to stand up and give him your seat, sort of like the Jim Crow laws that were passed in the Deep South after the Civil War, you know. This is still the way it is today if you're a Christian and you live in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Anyway, if a Muslim came by your house, you had to put him up and feed him for 3 days. If they wanted to come into your church and put their horses in there, and you had to let them. If they destroyed your church, you could not rebuild it on pain of death. And you couldn't bring your dead by a Muslim cemetery. Anyway, this is called the dhimmi status, and it's still in existence today. And then the Muslims attacked Constantinople. Now, if you see the Black Sea, and then there's the Mediterranean Sea, and where the Black Sea empties into the Mediterranean Sea, there's a little bitty sliver there, and that's where Constantinople is. Constantine was the Roman emperor who converted to Christianity. And Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire there, and this is sort of where Europe and Asia touched, and trade went through the city. But in 698 AD, the Muslims were repelled because the Byzantines had a military advantage called Greek fire. And this is where they took oil and sawdust and put it in brass containers and would spray it. Let me see, I have a picture of it here. They would pump it under pressure and spray it out of the ships. And so the Muslims had no defense for this. They would, again, take that oil and they'd pump it in these brass containers and spray it in what's called hot oil cannons, and it would go about 50 yards and it would catch the Muslim sails on fire. And so they turned back. And then the Muslims came around North Africa and through the Tripoli, and then they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain. Now, this is the year 711. So everybody say 711. Like the convenience store? Well, in the year 711, 80,000 Muslims crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain. Now, they had a military advantage this time, and it was called the stirrup. Now, how many of you have ridden horses? The stirrup is that thing you put your feet in? Well, do you know that the Romans and the Greeks did not have stirrups? They had saddles, but nothing to put your feet in. The stirrup was invented by the Mongolian nomads over by China. And the nomads would tie a rope around the horse and leave 2 loops hanging for their big toes because they would ride barefoot. And it would help them keep balance. And that invention made its way to China by the 5th century AD, and they made the loops big enough for your whole foot. And that invention made its way across the trade routes to Persia. And the Persians put leather straps and wooden blocks in there, so now these stirrups you can now stand in. And you could put the full power of a galloping horse behind your sword. So the Muslims developed these curved swords called scimitars. And they were made of Damascus steel, And that's where they would take the steel and bend it over and hammer it and bend it over again and hammer it. So they could be very thin, but very sharp. And it was a curve, which was excellent for slashing. They could literally slice somebody in half while riding at a full gallop. So in the year 711, 80,000 of these Muslims crossed into Spain, and the Europeans still fought on foot with heavy metal swords. And so these were like F-16s coming in. I mean, 80,000 of them galloping at full speed, and they just mowed them down, cut them to ribbons. In 10 years, they conquered all of Spain. Then they crossed the Pyrenees Mountains, and they crossed into southern France. You read the story of the Battle of Bordeaux in southern France. In one pass, the Muslim army totally annihilated the entire Frankish army. And then the Muslims came all the way close to Paris. And there's the Battle of Tours. So Pope Gregory puts out a plea that anybody that could fight should join Charles Martel. Charles Martel was the grandfather of Charlemagne. Martel got 30,000 volunteers together. This was the largest army in Europe. You could go all the way to Poland, and there was not an army of this size. So in other words, if Charles Martel was not successful in stopping the Islamic invasion, all of Europe would have been conquered and become Muslim, and you and I would be speaking Arabic right now, because there would have been no German, French, or English languages ever developed. Anyway, so this was a pretty important battle. Martel decided instead of standing in a field waiting to get sliced up, he would have his men sneak up the hill, and he would put them up the top of the hill and wait for the Muslims to attack. So his men were in a complete square. And the next morning, the Muslim commander, Abdul Rahman, looks up the hill and orders a charge. Well, he can't get at a full gallop because of the trees and because of charging uphill. And when he breaks through what he thought was the line, it wasn't a line. It was 30,000 men in one square. So these guys got stuck about a dozen guys deep. And then meanwhile, Martel had pre-arranged for some of his men to sneak into the Muslim camp and free the captives. Muslims fought for religion and for plunder. Again, the Sultan got a fifth of the plunder, and many sultans had 1,000 wives. One reportedly had 12,000 wives. And so as the warriors saw their booty being let go, they would leave the fighting to go back and protect their stuff. And the commander, Abdul Rahman, sees his warriors leaving the battlefield, and he tries to rally them back, and he's getting distracted, and he ends up getting killed. And so now the Muslim warriors could not decide who their next commander was going to be, and so they pick up and leave and go back to Spain. And that was the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, exactly 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. So they went from the tents of Arabia to Paris in 100 years through military conquest. I mean, the Quran wasn't even written down for most of that time. And when the people in Europe were invaded, none of them even spoke Arabic. So there was no attempt to try to make a rational conversion. It was all through military conquest. It is interesting that when Caliph Uthman decided to compile these little bits of the Quran, that they were on leaves and pieces of bone and parchment, and he had them put together, and he decided to burn the ones that he didn't like. And so some of the Shiites think that he may have burned some that favored the Shiites instead. But nevertheless, he compiled them in order of length. So the longest surahs or chapters are at the front of the Quran, and the shortest surahs are at the back of the Quran. So if they were to do that with the Bible, the first chapter in the Bible would be Psalms 119, and the last verse would be Jesus wept, you know. And so there's not a chronological thought that runs through the Quran. Anyway, so then the Muslims conquered into Africa, and then they conquered toward China, where they conquered Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and Pakistan and all these different areas. And as they came toward China, they ran into the Mongols. Now the Mongols, again, they're the ones that invented the stirrup. Is everybody still with me? I didn't leave anybody in Egypt or anything? Okay, so now we're around the year 800, 900, 1000, and as they're going back toward China, they run into the Mongols. Now, the Mongolian Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in world history. The Mongolian Empire went from Korea to Hungary, Russia down to Persia and India. It was huge. And the Mongols would fight on horseback. Remember, they developed the stirrup. But by this time, they invented the compound bow. It was a bow and arrow that could shoot 300 yards with a curve in it, you know. That's as far as the English longbow, only was half as big, so they could use it on horseback. So the Mongols would ride into town, like 700,000 of them would ride into town. They would shower arrows down upon the enemies, kill the men, take the women, and plunder. And when the Mongols began to run into the Muslims, the Mongols heard about this new religion. And they realized that they could continue to ride into town, kill the men, take the women, and plunder, only now do it with the blessing of Allah. And so one of the Mongolian tribes called the Turkish Mongols converted to Islam, and then they conquered back west. And the Turkish Muslims conquered the Arab Muslims. So Muhammad was an Arab Muslim. And then in Iran or Persia, they had Persian Muslims, but now we have Turkish Muslims. And so the Turkish Muslims conquered the Persian Muslims, conquered the Arab Muslims, and then the Turkish Muslims decided to invade into Asia Minor, which is the Byzantine Empire, south of the Black Sea, north of the Mediterranean Sea. The Byzantine Empire was the inheritor of the Roman Empire. This was the world empire. Constantinople was the capital of the world. It was the richest city in the world, had these huge three-tiered walls that had been built by these Roman emperors. And Constantinople was where all trade went through to get from Europe over to India and China. Now, it was all Christian. This is where Paul spoke and John spoke, where Ephesus and Galatia and Colossae and Antioch, where they spoke Greek, the language of the New Testament. Around the Black Sea, there are these caves in the lava rock where 60,000 Christians hid out from the Roman soldiers during the Roman persecutions. This was all a Christian area. And so when the Muslims began invading, the first sultan was Murat I. Actually, the major battle, the first beginning battle, was in 1071, the Battle of Mezikert. And so once the Muslims invaded into the Byzantine Empire, they would kill the Christians, turn the churches into mosques, take the bells from the churches and melt them down into cannons, and they would take the bones of the Christian saints and give them to the dogs. Now, guess who the most popular Byzantine Eastern Orthodox saint was? Saint Nicholas. Saint Nicholas lived during Roman times. He was a bishop of Myra, and he was very generous and gave to the poor. And there's a tradition of gift giving on the anniversary of St. Nicholas's death that the Byzantine Christians did for centuries. And so, matter of fact, Justinian, the Christian Roman emperor there in the Byzantine Empire, he built a huge cathedral at Myra for Nicholas, named after him. And then when Vladimir the Great, the emperor of Russia, converted to Eastern Orthodox Christianity in 988, Vladimir chose Nicholas as the patron saint of Russia. That's why so many people in Russia are named Nicholas or Nikolai. Anyway, so this Nicholas guy was very popular. Well, when the Muslims invaded into the Byzantine Empire, they were getting close to Myra. The Christians there didn't want the bones of their famous saint dug up and give to the dogs. And so they took his bones and they shipped them over to Italy. And this was a big deal because the Byzantine Christians viewed themselves as the true inheritors of Christianity. And they viewed the Latin Roman Catholic West as the church split. I mean, the Byzantine Christians spoke Greek, the language of the New Testament. Their land was where John spoke and Paul spoke, and Ephesus and Colossae and Galatia. They could show you all those cities. And so for them to take their most popular saint and ship him over to Italy was a big deal. Anyway, there's a cathedral to this day in southern Italy in the town of Bari with the remains of St. Nicholas and the Cattedrale Niccolò dei Bari. But this was in the 11th century. So this introduced Western Europe to the story of this Byzantine St. Nicholas and the practice of gift giving on the anniversary of his death. It became very popular. And matter of fact, Martin Luther, when the Reformation began, ended saints' days, and he moved all the gift giving to December 25th and said the gifts came from the Christ child. And the Germans pronounced that Chris Kindlen. And over the years, that morphed into Chris Kringle. But the other immigrants later brought it to America, and the Dutch brought the St. Nicholas traditions to New Amsterdam, which became New York, and the Dutch pronounced St. Nicholas Sant Niklaas, or Santa Claus. And so we would not have a Santa Claus over here if it wasn't for this jihad in 1087 when the Muslims invaded the Byzantine Empire over there, forcing them to move the bones of St. Nicholas. Anyway, the Byzantine Christians cried out to the Latin Roman Catholic West for help. And the West sent help. It was called the what? The Crusades. And the first crusade was in 1097, and the Byzantine Emperor, Comenius, sent a message to Pope Urban II begging for help. Pope Urban goes to the Consul at Clermont and begs the King of France to help. And he says, your Byzantine Christian brothers are being invaded by the Turk. And the Turk is forcing them to extend their necks, and they attempt with a single stroke of their sword to decapitate them. And so the French king decides to send a crusade over there to defend the Christians, and that was the first crusade. Now, then there were about 9 crusades in all, and they went on for about 200 years, and then they fizzled. But as long as the crusades went on, the fighting stayed in the Middle East. Once the crusades stopped is when the Muslims continued to invade into Europe, and there was the Sultan Murat I in the year 1365, and when he invaded into Asia Minor, he had a unique way to build the size of his army. He would take the Christian boys from the Christian families and force them to convert to Islam, put them into the Muslim army, and put them on the front lines when they would attack the next Christian city. They were called Janissaries, or new soldiers, and for 400 years they were the toughest soldiers in Europe. And anyway, here's a picture of one of the Janissaries. They had to wear big white hats in the battle. They were not allowed to grow full beards, only mustaches. They had to look to the Sultan as their father. And if they were delicate, they went into the Muslim pederasty, their homosexual culture. The sultans could have 1,000 wives, and boys were considered spoils of war. It was called the sodomy of the Turks. I won't get into it all. But anyway, as the Muslims would attack, they would take the church bells and melt them down into cannons. And then there was Sultan Mehmed II, who finally decided to attack Constantinople. Now the year is 1453. And Constantinople, again, was the biggest city in Europe. It was the richest city. And matter of fact, so many Greek scholars fled when the Byzantine Empire was being invaded by the Muslims. The Greek scholars fled to Italy and began the Renaissance. The Renaissance is what? It's a rediscovery of the Greek classics, the Greek language, the Greek architecture, the Greek literature. How come in the middle 1400s all these Italians are getting interested in things Greek? It's because the Greek scholars were fleeing the Islamic invasion. Anyway, people forget that Europe traded with India and China for centuries. Have everybody ever heard of Marco Polo? Marco Polo was an Italian who went from Italy to Venice to the Byzantine Empire, went across to India, crossed the Gobi Desert and the China Silk Road over to China. Marco Polo in 1271. Marco Polo worked for Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. Marco Polo brought back spaghetti, charcoal, gunpowder, talked about the Chinese having paper money. So in other words, Europe traded with India and China for centuries. But when the Islamic expansion happened, it cut off the trade routes, they attacked the caravans, they sacked the Byzantine Empire, and finally they conquered Constantinople. Now if you see here, see the Black Sea, and you see that Sea of Maramar there, and then where that purple is, that's that little Bosporus. It's a little river, and that's where Constantinople is. And you see it all empties into the Mediterranean Sea. Here's another little graphical picture where you can see that little pink area there is where on the Bosporus where Constantinople is, and this is a close-up of it. So here's the Bosporus, which comes from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, and there's a river there called the Golden Horn. There's the ancient Byzantium. There's Hagia Sophia. That was the largest church in Christendom for 1,000 years. It was built during Roman times, and 160 foot high, 102 foot across dome. And it's still there to this day. The Muslims just turned it into a mosque. And you can see these huge walls that were built there. Anyway.